Hello, welcome all of you enemies of the people to this Best of Britain live stream event. I'm Naomi Smith. Thank you all very much for tuning in. And as you should all know, joining me this evening is author, commentator, podcaster, and small L liberal Ian Dunt. For those of you who don't know, Ian and I first met on the 9th of June in 2017, when neither of us had managed any sleep after the relative elation of the general election result the night before. And we were both thrust into a dark basement in Soho, delirious with sleep deprivation, to record an episode of the podcast Romaniacs, where we probably both confidently predicted that Brexit could then be stopped. Anyway, I'm not sure which of us is Rick Blaine or Louis Renault, but that moment, at least for me, was certainly the beginning of a beautiful friendship. So I am absolutely delighted that he's given into my arm twisting to join us tonight so that he can tell us why his latest book, How to Be a Liberal, is relevant to those of us fighting the good fight for internationalist values to prevail once again in the UK. And if you've not bought the book already, you're in luck, because Ian is offering our lovely supporters a healthy discount code, and we will put details of that in the description box and comment section below the video. So keep your eyes peeled there. It really is a fantastic present for any politicos that we're going to make onto your gift list this year. And also, it makes a really good thing to put your laptop under, put under your laptop to make sure it's at the right height for a Zoom meeting. So it has dual functionality. Ian, welcome to Best for Britain.
Thank you very much. I remember that day we first met. I remember thinking, during an election sort of night, you have to, you get to that weird place where you're like, if I have another Red Bull, I'm going to puke. But if I don't have another Red Bull, I'm going to fall asleep. And I think you and I would have met at like sort of midday or 2 p.m. the next day. And I remember we did that thing and we left, and that was the last thing I had to do. And I was just like, right, well, I can go to the pub and have a pint now. And I had a pint. And as soon as I had the pint, I was like, oh yeah, no, that's going to make me vom, actually. It's going to be a real problem.
What's your poison tonight, speaking of pubs?
Chablis tonight. We're doing like a 2 week on, 2 week off drinking thing for lockdown period. And that means that you can actually be posher on the booze when you are drinking and you sort of care a bit more about it. But I'm sorry, Chablis. Now, exactly, yeah. Would you like to tell me what you're drinking? I already know the answer, but I want you to have to say it to more people than just me. It's very important.
It is rosé. Actually Kylie Minogue's rosé. don't at me, don't judge me. It's very, very good, actually. And I'm a huge fan of Kylie Minogue, and she was my first ever crush. So I won't hear a bad word said about her or her rosé, frankly. Right. Anyway, listeners, we're going to be broadcasting for the next hour, and the format of the session is going to be a bit of chat between me and Ian, and then we'll go into taking questions from the audience. We're going to try and get through as many of those as we can. So please type your question in the comment section below this video, and then I'll put the hardest ones to Ian. And remember that also in the comment section is where you're going to find a link to the book and a generous discount code. Ian, I was joking about the difficult questions.
Were you though?
Now, Ian, congratulations on the book. It is brilliant, and it's very, very comprehensive, and it covers liberalism all the way through from Descartes to Taylor Mill and beyond. But for our listeners, I want us to really focus in on how to be a liberal against this rising power of nationalist, nativist self-interest that's happening in the UK at the moment. And it really seems like the word liberal has become a dirty word. It's been co-opted by the right to mean anything from, market fundamentalism and consequent free speech, through to being used as a slur or even a weapon against those that stand up for minority or human rights. How have we got to this stage where liberal is such a dirty word?
So there's a bunch of stuff to unpack there. I mean, the first thing that I think took place is that a lot of us, not you, stopped using it about ourselves. And I think that's just because we just thought that a lot of these values were just kind of locked in place. So I was talking to a friend the other day who said, you would never have thought, like even 15 years ago, that you were ever going to have to argue for the separation of powers. for the fact that the executive shouldn't like attack the judiciary. And that just didn't seem like something you would ever need to say. So those core liberal ideas, it didn't feel like you needed to call yourself a liberal in that sense, because that was something you kind of didn't need to fight for anymore. These were set battles. They weren't just set, but I mean, they'd been set for hundreds of years. And then I think something else took over as well, which is that within liberalism, there's always been a split. And the split has really been about people who, when they think of the idea of the freedom of the individual, the basic cornerstone of liberal thought, some people think, well, that applies to the world as we find it now, but we don't really need to change the world. We just need to make sure that everyone has as much freedom as they've got right now. And typically that argument turns out to be quite right-wing. It's a laissez-faire argument. It translates into, you don't want too much interference in the market by the state. You don't need to think too deeply about what marginalized groups or women go through in terms of restraints on their freedom. You can just kind of let the world tick along. And then there's another side of liberalism, which is radical liberalism, egalitarian liberalism, which says we're going to start fixing the world. We're going to start changing, reforming, shifting the dynamics of power and of wealth. And that thinks, how do we make people, the individual, as free as possible if we start remaking the world, if we're aggressive about our principles? And I think really, since the mid to late 70s, laissez-faire liberalism was ascendant. And what it did was it sort of created this image of liberalism as this kind of complacent thing. It was for white people. It was for rich people. It lost touch with the fundamental radicalism that had driven it for years. And so it increasingly just got seen and associated with people who actually had a quite limited sense of what liberalism could achieve. It allowed us to fossilize, and it held us open to an assault. And then eventually the assault claim, and there just weren't enough of ourselves who were thinking in liberal terms, who considered themselves liberals, in order to mount a defense against that assault.
I mean, trigger warning, I am going to be talking a bit about 2016, and let's go back to that fateful referendum year. In your chapter, The New Nationalism, you say that unlike in other countries, the UK pretty much ushered nationalism in through the front door in the form of Nigel Farage. He was of the right, but he was outside the formal Conservative Party, flanking it from the right, and wielded disproportionate influence over the Conservative Party. So my question to you is, why hasn't someone successfully done that on the Liberal wing?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. You could argue that we saw a bit of that, and not to a tremendously effective extent, in the dynamic between the Liberal Democrats and Labour last year, that actually you got this threat from the Liberal side on the Labour Party, and that pushed Labour to adopt a more radical position than it would otherwise have done. Now, that didn't work out terribly well, but the dynamic was there. And of course, Farage's approach didn't work out terribly well for year after year after year until it did. I think you get the same with some European countries, some other Western countries, where typically the Greens, or at least the sort of minority left party, or a minority liberal party, will tend to act as a brake on some of the tendencies in the larger mainstream parties. So you do see a bit of it. We haven't been as effective. And I wonder if some of that isn't to do with the kind of mercurial nature that the Liberal Democrats have in their relationship with Labour. Like sometimes they're on the right of it, sometimes they're on the left of it. They usually play a better job on civil liberties issues with Labour. You think back to the kind of relationship the Lib Dems had with Labour during the Tony Blair years, where they're a depository for sort of anti-Iraq war votes, but also for, anti-ID cards, extended detention without trial. So there are elements in which that works, but it's true that we haven't been as effective about it. However, it's not to overstate what Farage accomplished, right? For Farage's plan to work, what you needed was an incredibly infantile, short-termist, and irresponsible prime minister, leader of the Conservative Party. And he had that in the shape of David Cameron. What David Cameron offered when he offered the referendum didn't have to be offered. It was essentially to secure decent local election results in an election campaign that none of us can even remember now, while we're still dealing with a systemic change that Brexit heralded. So it's not, I don't think we should fool ourselves into thinking that it was some kind of genius ploy by Farage. It relied on having an idiot Conservative prime minister. And that, unfortunately, was exactly what we had.
Now, Leave.eu and Vote Leave were the two sort of official pro-Brexit campaign groups during the referendum. And part of the reason why there were two was that they were meant to demarcate the extreme from the moderate nationalists on that pro-Brexit side. Mm-hmm. In your view, was that always just a false construct, given that the Vote Leave government we are now saddled with could hardly be more nativist than it is.
No, it wasn't false, but it broke down. And I don't think it necessarily would have if it wasn't for Cummings. I mean, this is the thing, you know. I mean, personalities matter. People in certain circumstances matter, even if the people themselves are sort of relatively minor in terms of intellect or moral capacity. And in this case, it really mattered. Where Cummings himself seemed to think he was operating at the beginning was that he would let Farage do that bit, right? The calculation, he's written about all this. The calculation was Farage can bank you 25% of the population who are basically passionately anti-immigration. They don't like the EU either, but ultimately the thing that motivates them is anti-immigration. And he would just bank those. And what Cummings thought was, right, I have to get the other guys. And our expectation was then that he could use Farage as a sort of moral laundering system, right? Like he would bank all of those kind of nasty, little bit racist sort of votes. And you could then make a centre-right appeal and even a centrist appeal for Euroscepticism. That isn't what he did. He actually pursued quite a tough anti-immigrant line. You remember they sent out leaflets on Turkey, on Turkish membership of joining the EU, where they would point out sort of, you know, Syria and Iraq. I mean, essentially, it was a racialized campaign being run by the supposedly respectable centrist element. But much more importantly than that, I think, what Cummings introduced was a recognition that truth didn't really have an operative function in British politics at that moment. And most of us hadn't quite recognized that. And that was the result.
Or now.
No, well, exactly. It certainly doesn't now, because he's had so much time to chip away at it even further, as we're seeing, I think, you know, day to day during COVID. Like, that came from a long line of processes, right? I mean, that came from the damage to public trust from the Iraq war, from the financial crisis, from MPs' expenses, from journalists' phone hacking. You had scandal after scandal after scandal, chiseling away at this kind of institutional structure of British democracy. So eventually, when you got to the referendum, Cummings had that core realization of just like, I can say whatever I want. We can replace truth-telling with tribalism. And as long as we just appeal to those instinctive, emotional, cultural trigger points with people, they just won't care what the actual truth is. And in fact, the people that talk about the truth, we can use them to re-weaponize it against them, to spread our own narrative. So that part, more just really than the left-rightness of the politics, but the methodology that he deployed, this extremely sort of corrosive, cancerous methodology, actually that proved to be the really radical, the really very dangerous element that Cummings introduced. And that did not come from Farage. That came from the supposedly respectable campaign.
I'm going to come back to the things that you touched on there about truth and misinformation and how lies prevail. But before we do, I just want to go back to what you were saying about the xenophobia and the racism, the anti-immigration drive that was behind much of the way some Leave voters chose to cast their ballot. How influential was that infamous Leave.eu breaking point poster that Farage unveiled before polling day? It had that sea of dark faces, non-white faces, queuing up to enter Britain.
The answer is that we don't know. I mean, we don't have the testing for exactly how many people's votes that affected. What we do know is we know culturally the impact that it had, and in a quite specific way. So, I mean, Viktor Orban in Hungary, in many ways, a sort of inspiration for figures like Farage and Cummings. Actually used exactly the same poster in his own referendum campaign 2 years afterwards. Sort of clearly saw how it worked. For Orban, it's a much more explicit campaign of sort of anti-Muslim immigration, much more akin to the kind of thing he'd normally put out. It's sort of based on this idea of, you know, dark-skinned men are coming to rape white women. That is, I'd say, from the propaganda I've seen put out on advertising billboards and in newspapers in Hungary, that makes up about nearly a third of the kind of imagery that you see. So it was eagerly adopted there, but I think it had a broader effect because that poster came out and around the same sort of time we got the assassination of Joe Cox. And there was a sense, I think, in the political class after that, especially from Theresa May and from Nick Timothy, that it had demonstrated something fundamental, a fundamental change in British politics, that it wasn't just about we're going to leave the EU. It wasn't even just we're going to end free movement. It was that nativism was now the mandate. more than leaving the EU, more than anything else, it was to embrace nativist narratives. And that is precisely what they did. So I think it played a part by virtue of the fact that it didn't alienate enough people, by virtue of the fact that even that combined with the assassination didn't swing the vote. It then got treated as a mandate, as if it had been vindicated, as we're doing. And that was part of the osmotic process by which the Tory party was taken over by the nationalism of UKIP.
And of course, it was all nonsense. Turkey is not imminently about to join the EU, etc., etc. So they were tapping into fear. I think that anti-immigration sentiment, that xenophobia, comes from a place of fear. That's why we put the word phobia on the end of it. And they were tapping into that far more, it would seem, than any of the Project Fear messaging being pumped out by our own side, surely. So how come it was the internationalists that got so successfully labelled with Project Fear and not them?
Yeah, that was part of our losing. It's a really good way of putting it, that if there was fear, it was coming from that side. But I would sort of suggest that it's not just cultural. I mean, one of the things you get whenever you look at the sort of academic work on what happened with Trump and what happened with Brexit is you get this split between, was it culture or was it economics? And the obvious answer is everybody sees that it's both. But if you look at most of the rhetoric, and the same again goes for the Trump campaign, is this entwining of economic uncertainty around cultural uncertainty. So the immigrant, I mean, if you look at lots of Trump's election campaigns in 2016, you'd see this image of like always the white American worker, a working class worker, and sort of like a hard hat, and the increased competition he was getting from abroad. So goods coming in from China essentially played the same role as humans coming in from Mexico. So it was that sense of sort of uncertainty, of simple answers to firm things up, to put walls on borders, whether it's a figurative wall of Brexit or the hard wall that Trump wanted to put up. So it is fear, but of course they're also playing into real economic anxieties that people have that can't be fixed by the kind of programs that they put forward. In fact, the programs that they put forward worsen the conditions for exactly those voters, especially in manufacturing. Manufacturing under Brexit is going to get a much harder time than, for instance, financial services are under Brexit. And in fact, in specifically the kind of areas that have voted for Boris Johnson. So it is fear, but it's not just fear. It's also part of this thing of trying to create a narrative around the lack of certainty that people were given by a financial system that had run out of control, and by a governing ideology, a form of liberalism, right-wing liberalism, neoliberalism, people call that for laissez-faire, which essentially said, it's not our job to help you. This is just the winds of change. This is just globalization. Nothing can be done to help you. And that allowed them that opportunity to wrap those ideas around immigration, around ideas around trade, around ideas around sovereignty, around ideas about there being simple solutions to very complicated problems, and to just deliver that message into government.
Now, you say in the book that nationalism pretends that we only have one identity. And I suspect many people watching tonight will feel that they have many, many more than just the one. But nationalism purports that we cannot be more than one thing at once, and it makes us uniform. So in your view, is it true that all forms of nationalism, and I'm going to specifically bring in Scottish nationalism here that often calls itself civic nationalism, is that true? Has there ever been a time in history when nationalism, whatever its shade, didn't eventually develop into ethno-nationalism?
There's a problem here with terminology. Yeah. Because you would hear lots of, the word nationalism used to be used. I mean, so if you'd asked John Stuart Mill in the 1800s, are you a nationalist? He would probably have said yes. But he didn't mean by that what we mean by it. The same for socialist. He called himself a socialist. He didn't really mean by that either what we mean by it. And most of the project, when you look at what the SNP are demanding, I don't agree with it as it happens, but looking at it fairly, is essentially a call for independence. Now, independence is not the same as nationalism. What matters with nationalism is what is the manner in which you're talking about political problems. Do you pretend that the group that you represent are homogenous, as we do, for instance, when we say the people here as part of Brexit rhetoric? Do you pretend that they are fundamentally incompatible with other people? Do you pretend that all problems that are faced in the practical application of your ideas are the result of a conspiracy against you by forces on the outside and by traitors on the inside? Again, we've obviously seen an awful lot of that over the last few years. You and I pay particular attention because we were among the traitors on the inside and ideally on the outside when we could go on holiday. So at the moment, the SNP haven't represented much of that. There are glimmers of concern that I would have with the SNP. So, for instance, I think their rhetoric overdoes, and in fact, you see a lot of this from Scott Nats on Twitter, overdoes the distinction between Scottish people and English people, for instance. If you break down sort of polling on even things like attitude to immigration, you'll find that actually the feeling, the values are broadly comparable.
Yeah.
But this is relatively minor in the grand scheme of things, but certainly that distinction is overblown. There's something else on complication, on acceptance of the complication of life. I think when you look at what happens, I do believe the Scottish independence is going to happen. I do believe there's going to be a referendum. I think it'll be impossible to stop, and I do believe that they'll win it. But let's just assume that that does take place. The questions that the SNP will have to answer are precisely the ones that the Brexiters have had to answer. Okay? Now, if you want to say, and they are going to want to say, we want to join the EU now, and I totally understand why they want to do that, and I'm not going to pretend that I wouldn't support that if I was in Scotland. You are going to have to answer the question of what happens on the border between England and Scotland, because you're going to be applying to a regulatory organisation that has different regulations by definition to the ones that we have now. That requires customs checks, that requires regulatory checks, that requires sort of sanitary and phytosanitary border inspection posts. That requires the full range of what a border entails. Now, will they address that problem by being honest about it, by engaging in the trade-offs of going, fine, but this is the future that we're picking, and this is a necessary, pain that we're going to have to experience for it? Or will they say, these are all lies, myths made up by traitors on the outside in order to undermine our glorious national process? And I think in that process, you'll see the reality of where that project goes. I suspect the SNP will be much better than the Brexiters about it, but the temptation for them will be to be exactly the same as the Brexiters have behaved over here over the last 4 years.
Well, let's go back to the topic of truth and reason and the need for liberalism for those things to prevail. The world over, but particularly notably at the moment in the USA, politicians seem to get away with lying and spreading misinformation with total abandon. In the book, you link this in no small part back to the referendum campaign here, where truth and power lost all credence. Gove saying that we were all sick of experts. Truth seemed to lose out to fiction, and perhaps most notably with that £350 million for the NHS lie being slapped on the side of a bus. You're a journalist. Why didn't more journalists call that lie out at the time?
Well, I think they did. I certainly remember a lot of people saying, well, this figure is questionable. There is a question as to the language that journalists use when they do this stuff. And you get that in a quite powerful way when it comes to Boris Johnson. So the head of Channel 4 News, when Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, did a speech in Edinburgh and said, look, the guy's demonstrably a liar. So we're journalists, and we have to decide what do you do when an outright liar, when an inveterate liar, rather than a classic politician, lies when he breathes kind of guy, goes into Downing Street. And he's like, well, it's our job to use the word. And actually, the moment that shook her up wasn't quite the NHS promise. It was actually the Turkey promise. And it was an interview on Mar, quite a telling interview, where he was talking to, can't remember which minister, I think it was the defense minister at the time, I think. And said, well, look, you're saying that Britain doesn't have any ability to stop Turkey becoming a member, but in fact, we have a veto. She said, that's just not true. And he called her answer, quote, unusual. So Dorothy Parker's argument was like, it might be unusual, but unusual is not a sufficient description of what this was. It is a lie. And our job is to not just say that information is wrong, but to highlight to the reader, to the viewer, that actually someone is trying to deceive them at the moment. Now, I think ultimately in our impartial news services, none of this applies to the tabloid press, or obviously that's very, very different. But when it comes to organizations like the BBC, there has to be a toughening up. And that involves a reassessment of what your job is. Your job is not to be an umpire. Your job is to have a much more intimate relation with the listener or the viewer than that. It is to say, actually, this part we can say to be true, and this part is not. It is not a matter of opinion. It is simply not a matter of opinion, whether Britain had a veto over Turkish membership of the EU. That is a black and white issue. The answer is it did. So that part did need to be fixed up. But ultimately, I have to say, when a massive cultural change is taking place, and what was inflicted on Britain during that referendum was a significant cultural change. It was essentially the eradication of truth-telling as an operative principle in British politics. It can be very hard for institutions to catch up. You're sort of lost in the fierceness of it. What's more dispiriting, I think, has been the slowness since that moment, especially in the broadcast press, to be able to realize that it has a duty, a democratic duty on this function. During the referendum campaign itself, I kind of get it, because we were all still feeling the ground fall out from underneath our feet.
So we've talked about the traditional media, but fake news obviously spreads like absolute wildfire on social media. So I suppose my question to you on that is whether big tech is a bigger threat to liberalism than it is enabler of liberalism. How do you see it?
It definitely is. Sorry. Yeah. Terrible timing.
Sorry, it made the question longer.
Yeah, I know. I thought you were going to stretch out the words. I thought you knew how to operate with me when I was vaping. We have years of experience. So it definitely is a bigger threat. And it wasn't always clear that that would be the case. When you go back to the Arab Spring, it seemed at that moment that social media, any sort of Web 2.0, basically user-generated content, was going to be a significant help for liberalism. It was going to give the individual powers over the state that they hadn't previously had, essentially because of the means of production, essentially because they didn't have the money to, you know, buy a camera, to distribute the kind of film, that sort of thing. Now, finally, you had mobile phones, you had social media stations, you could just put this stuff out. And in fact, that flame really spread out across the Middle East before it went catastrophically wrong. It did have the power of overthrowing leaders, for instance, in Egypt. And then something changed. And I think the reason that it changed goes fundamentally to what it is that these companies are. Companies like Facebook, companies like Twitter, companies even like Google, when you look at sort of the involvement with YouTube. But we think of them as service providers, but in fact, they are advertising companies. They make their revenue through advertising. And the main mechanism in advertising is engagement. And that is what these guys track. They don't care about any other metric. They track engagement. The things that engage us as humans, and this is not a new development, this goes all the way back in our species' history, are essentially things around tribalism and emotions. And that sometimes can be fairly sort of harmless. I mean, when you see, you know, those tawdry, trashy little adverts underneath an article of like, you know, what she did next will shock you. Essentially what they're doing is they're promising you an emotional reaction. And we are extremely susceptible towards that. The same is true with tribalism. And the tribalism is quite deep-seated. So, for instance, on social media, they found that if you just get a few data points from people, and these seem quite unrelated data points. I mean, some of them will be like, you know, do you like Sex and the City? Do you like this kind of food? Do you like Lady Gaga? I mean, Lady Gaga was literally one of the data points. They could start predicting extremely intimate information about you. They could take your parents' marital status, how you voted, how you thought about cultural issues, your age, whether you lived in a metropolitan area or not. And using those segments, they could start targeting sort of messaging towards you. Now, in most cases, that's mostly just about maintaining engagement, keeping you scrolling on your phone, checking on the laptop screen.
Keeping you watching this video right now on YouTube or Facebook.
Well, yes, exactly. Yes, exactly.
Engage me and engage them.
No, well, yes, and you should be wary of these outlets, which isn't to say you should stop using them. It's about us and how we use them. But certainly, this has proven a sort of rocket fuel towards tribalism, and by virtue of tribalism, towards a decline of truth. And that, again, is a process that's very well established. I mean, George Orwell was talking about this in 1945 in Notes on Nationalism, of when you get information, processing it, not by its veracity, but by whether it is useful to the group of people to which you claim allegiance. Now, these are old processes, old dynamics in the human brain, but this technology has really put fire into them. And social media companies so far have not shown really the vigilance in order to try and address these problems. There's little hints of it sometimes. YouTube is starting to get wary of just how much criticism it's getting because of this, because essentially it functions as a radicalism agent towards people viewing its videos. But at the moment, they haven't shown the degree of investment, the degree of responsibility in order to try and harness and reverse these trends.
And I mean, anti-truth rhetoric eventually must come back to hurt politicians. And as the transition period comes to an end, and perhaps with it, no deal, won't Johnson face the same fate that your book says befell May when she becomes Prime Minister after the referendum, that she had to turn all of this anti-truth, pro-Brexit rhetoric into policy that was now having to function within objective reality?
Yeah, well, this is so we can't underestimate them, but we shouldn't overestimate them either. So you look at what Johnson's about to face, right? Like when May really came unstuck was when she had to come up with a proposal that was actually based on any kind of truth at all. You know, as soon as Brexit went from all these dreams and myths and aspirations and unicorns and rainbows into
days of levers.
Well, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so suddenly it fell apart. I mean, I remember that day. You know, you got David Davis resigning, you got Boris Johnson resigning. Basically, as soon as it hit reality, they were just like, well, I'm not having any of this. This wasn't the special dream work supply that I was promised. Boris Johnson managed to evade that the first time around when he signed up to a deal. Mostly because there was just this desperation from that side of just like, we feel like we might be losing our project here. We better just get this thing done. It's not clear that that will save him in January. Now, in January, like today, they're starting to make a lot more noise. I mean, they've re-entered talks. I mean, look, I would, at this point, would I bet my house? I'd certainly bet a lot of money that there will be a deal. Like, I mean, it just seems clear to me. If it was going to be no deal, they would have definitely done it over this period. I really think it's quite clear there's going to be a deal. There's certainly no content there. There's no division on the proposals that's so severe that they wouldn't do a deal if they wanted to. And if they've gone back to the table now, it's because they do want to do it. However, the kind of thin deal that Johnson's talking about, basically just let's get rid of tariffs, is brutal on borders. You are recreating borders that have been gone for 40 years. And that means customs checks. It means safety and security documentation. It means tailbacks. Because ultimately you put a lot of shipments, sometimes thousands of shipments on a lorry. Only one of those has to have the wrong paperwork on one of those documents. Safety and security documentation alone's got 36 data points in it before the whole truck gets held up. So the whole thing is going to be, and I think those problems on the border are probably going to last for the first quarter, at least, maybe the first 2 quarters of 2021, before companies think we really have to get our shit together here. We have to get a customs broker. We have to get a freight forwarder and just sort out how we're going to do this. So on that basis, that will be a moment of truth for him. How well will he escape it this time? It's not clear that it'll be as easy for him as it was last time. It's possible they can blame the Europeans, you know, they're trying to undermine us. But actually, we haven't seen much evidence that the British public are prepared to blame the EU for the way that these negotiations have gone. It's quite possible we can use it to damage him. And I think the same when you look at COVID. This is something that reflects people's lives. It reflects the quality of their life, the security of their loved ones, their economic life. And there they are actually more stringent on the way that they approach Johnson's behavior. So look, these guys are better at it than May was. They definitely are. Cummings and Johnson are vastly more efficient than she was. But then, of course, that's not hard because she was catastrophically bad at almost everything that she did. However, we shouldn't overestimate their capacity. Like, we can hold them to it now. And I think the start of, I mean, it's happening now on COVID. In January, we have to make them own that thing. And I think that we will.
Well, you're segueing nicely now into my final few questions before we go to the audience for theirs. I really want to inject some hope into proceedings because doubtless some people watching may feel that the battle is already lost. And as you said, a thin deal is barely any better than no deal. So we as a bloc, if you like, of open society internationalists, we need to sell our values to the British people again. And we're going to need stories that can persuade people that an outward-looking Britain will be a happier and more equal country, and that immigration is a beautiful and beneficial thing. So how should any campaigners that are watching tonight take your book and then message around it in a way that will cut through to the average voter?
Oh, God. When you ask me about campaign, it's like Mo Farah asking me about running or something. I'm just like, I don't want to talk. I always feel uncomfortable when you ask me these. Okay, fine. Look, first to me on issues around diversity and pluralism and immigration is, and look, this is personal. Like different people have it in a different way. For me, it's to ground these ideas in a sense of patriotism and place and believing in my country. because these things are not incompatible. And in fact, to me, it is one of the great nationalist lies that, you know, that these ideas are incompatible. To me, it's about a vision of Britain as an open place and a confidence in Britain. When people, so I'll often do sort of talks on talk radio or something like that, where lots of the questions you're getting, people calling in, are basically like, well, immigrants, you know, taking away what it is to be British. And you're like, well, when did you start losing confidence in Britain so much that you thought someone coming over could suddenly eradicate the idea of it from people's minds, right? Like, why don't you think people want to associate with that? And that actually the idea of Britain is so strong that it is broadened and enriched by having people come to it. But that method of constantly basing these ideas on the fact that you are patriotic, and I know that's not for everyone. I get that. Like, a lot of my friends just aren't patriotic. They don't care. That's not part of their identity, and it doesn't have to be. Right? I mean, you have the complete freedom to feel this way or not, and that's what a free country is. But for those of us that do have that sense of loving our country and loving where we live, I think it's important to base those ideas in that way. The other one, to me, is just to fight smart, right? Like, you look at what's going on today in the Commons. These are sort of weak example, but whatever. The thing that's going on today as an indication. Like, what are the two motions that Labour is using against the government? It's on financial help to people when they're in tier 3 lockdown, and it's on free school meals. Now, these are good moral points. These are objectively important things in their own right, but they're also something that's being picked because of the damage it does, because of thinking, well, we've been shoved onto the wrong side of public opinion on several issues. We know how the culture war works, which is to tell people that anyone that has liberal values is completely inimical and in opposition to the majority of the public. So actually, it is our job to find places where the public and liberal values are in the same place and pointing in the same direction, and harness that to just do damage to these guys. Because we cannot survive if these guys get in power another time. Like, the mountain to climb in 2025 is vast beyond comprehension. The catastrophe of Corbynism was so severe that we have to climb so far just to stand easy, just to even, you know, get a hung parliament. Now, we cannot let them win that election. And to do that, we have to fight smart. We have to be aware of where our vulnerabilities are and avoid those attacks wherever possible. Sometimes on asylum, for instance, you can't. You've got to fight for your values. You've got to do something to protect refugees coming. But in other cases, you know, the obvious ones is like, you know, the last night of the proms or something. You know, you just sidestep that culture war assault. You see what's being done to you. And instead you find, where are these guys off kilter with what the public thing is, and you push them remorselessly into that corner.
Well, as our listeners type some questions into the comment section below the video, I'm going to ask you one final question. Now, the book is called How to Be a Liberal. So I half expected some kind of like self-help manual, you know, a listicle, a checklist of things I need to do every morning when I wake up before I've even had my coffee. It isn't that, but give me your top 3 ways each of us could be a better small L liberal.
Okay, 3. It's very precise. I think the first one is, and I know this doesn't sound very exciting, but it is to be polite and civil in disagreement, and to think the most of your opponent. This was core to liberalism for a long time. I mean, one of liberalism's core ideas is that conflict isn't ever really going to stop. Like, the great utopian sort of visions, fascism and communism and whatever, they promise, you know, just do this and then everything will be, it's happily ever after. It's the fairy story. Liberalism doesn't promise that. It acknowledges that human conflict, from values, from identity, from any number of reasons, is endemic. And what it seeks to do is to alleviate the severity of it, the sharpness of the blade. And part of that is in the manner in which we conduct ourselves. Now, anyone that follows me on Twitter knows I'm not polite all the time, and there's definitely plenty of moments there when I'm like saying pretty terrible things about people. But generally speaking, hopefully, when you're having a debate with someone, you search for the strongest version of their argument rather than the weakest. And you try to act with a certain degree of civility and generosity in the manner in which you do it. And that becomes the sort of the protection around the joints, just to stop things from becoming too warlike, too fierce, too violent. I think that's a core part of it. The second then is to seek out people that you disagree with, but that you admire. And this is core, not just to the great sort of, you know, we must find the truth somewhere, but also something bigger than that, which is curing the arrogance, the sort of innate chauvinism of the mind. That thing that we all instinctively feel, well, we just know what's best. We know what's best. And we think that more, the less contact we have with sort of alien ideas. John Stuart Mill said that the key to this was actually learning another language. That by learning another language, you would realize that there were whole thoughts, whole ideas that you just couldn't even verbalize in your own. And that helped sort of protect you against the arrogance of one-sidedness, intellectual one-sidedness. The third and the most important for me, and again, this comes from Harriet Taylor and John Stuart Mill, is the idea of autonomy. And this is a personal idea more than a political idea. It's to say, it doesn't matter what life you pick. Like, you could work for a charity all your life, you can sit and play PlayStation all your life, you can work for a big city firm, just worry about money, whatever, you can be a monk. What matters is that you choose it. That you didn't base it on what your society thinks, what your family thinks, what your friends think, what your followers on Twitter think, you know, what the things that you know will make you popular. You chose it yourself. You were present in your decision making. And that's, I think, like a tremendously beautiful idea and an almost impossible one to do. I mean, it's very hard to live life in this way, but that is a life that is truly lived. And people who live that way will think for themselves. And at the heart of everything in liberalism, when you get to the real bones of it, that's what it demands of you, to think for yourself, to not go with the herd, to not go with the crowd, to think for yourself. That idea, I think, like for my life, is the most important sort of idea to just govern the manner in which I want to be conducted, in which the way I want to think about my life when it's over. And that, I think, is just key to what it is to be a liberal.
So be polite, seek out people you disagree with, but admire, and make sure that you are living the best version of your life that you can, thinking for yourself. Well, thank you. I will certainly try to do a little bit more of that. Certainly of the second one, which I'm probably definitely not doing. Occasionally the first as well. Okay, so we've got some questions coming through. Thank you very much. Do keep them coming through. We've got a good sort of 15 minutes or so. We've got one from a Mr. Campbell. What have been the liberal high points and low points of your lifetime, and what lessons have they taught you?
Of my lifetime, the high point is freedom of movement. And I think freedom of movement is a liberal moment that is, I mean, utterly historic. And this is not about my lifetime. This is about the whole 400-year period of that thought. Because it was always about the freedom of the individual. How do you make the individual more free? And for the first time in human history, the individual became free in space. Like, I mean, technically, there was freedom movement before, you know, in the sort of 1800s, 1700s, because no one could get to another country very easily. You know, it's really hard to get from one country to another. Yeah. So there was no need for any kind of immigration laws. But as soon as it became viable, as soon as it was practically possible, they put up those rules. Freedom of movement became something that was new in human history. It was literally the freedom to go where you like in the world, to live with whoever you want. An almost kind of geometric freedom that was suddenly available to people. And more than that, it came with a dream, right? Like, as soon as it became real, you could see a potential future was 50 years or 100 years from now, where the EU might do a trade deal with sort of NAFTA states, you know, so sort of Canada and America and Mexico. And that might include free movement too. And maybe, you know, you would have South American states who would also have the same arrangements, internal free movement, suddenly doing great trade bloc negotiations. And it suddenly wasn't impossible to think that in a sort of 150 years or something, we could have the freedom to go wherever we liked on this earth without any states getting in our way or providing any hindrance to us. And that, I think, is a truly beautiful dream, which I haven't given up on just because this country has decided that it suddenly needs to sit in the fucking rain for the rest of its life rather than retire in Spain. That is the highest moment, and it is a moment that we will have again when we rejoin. The worst point, it's not Brexit really, it is Trump. I mean, I want to say Brexit because it means more to me, because obviously I care more about what happens in this country than I do in America. But the truth is, it's Trump, in that just Trump, at least with Brexit, there are coherent arguments, there's sovereignty arguments. We may or may not agree with them, but they're credible, that they are intellectually coherent. And there were wings of leave, some of them are my friends now, sort of liberal leavers who could express them. I mean, with Trump, it was just the death of anything that was virtuous in politics. And I know that sounds excessive, but it isn't. It is an accurate demonstration of what he is. And that just seems to me to be a terrible moment for liberalism, of course, coming as it does from the most powerful country in the world.
But will the effects of Trump be felt for a shorter period of time than the effects of Brexit will in Europe?
Absolutely, they will. So Brexit's more boring. It seems like a more minor event than Trump, but actually, because you're messing around in the engine room of a country with Brexit, so it's actually a more severe project in terms of the core components. But culturally, Trump was more of a spit in the face of liberalism than Brexit was.
There's a lovely question here from somebody about the process of writing your book, from Alan J. He says, what was the hardest part of researching or writing the book? And also a follow-up question, what will and should liberalism look like by 2030?
All of it was hard. It was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. Like, by distance, there's no comparison. It was 2 years of the hardest work I've ever done.
I think someone should give you an honorary PhD for it, because I read it and I thought he's put more work into this than most of my mates with PhDs ever did with that.
Oh, thank you, Ben. Yeah, it was brutal, and I never ever want to do anything like that again. It was horrific. The amount of research will kill you, and reading lots of these sort of philosophical texts is no fun. Probably the two hardest, sort of intellectually, the most difficult bits were probably the financial crash. So there's quite a long section where I just try to say what happened in the financial crash. The financial crash is a result of laissez-faire liberalism, of a lack of regulation, to demonstrate what laissez-faire liberalism does. And just trying to understand things around repo markets, around commercial paper markets, around the use of assets in order to sort of leverage in order to access the money markets. It's extremely complicated, and just trying to get properly, you can't explain anything simply until you really properly understand it. So it's kind of like an iceberg, right? The thing you see is the very tip, but the body of it is underneath the water, and just trying to understand it was very, very difficult indeed. The other one was probably the chapter on identity politics, because the work around identity, the academic work around identity, is really complicated, very, very hard to understand. It uses a whole set of terminology that I wasn't really familiar with. And then trying to do that and trying to address the bits where you accept and you can agree with, and the bits that you do not accept and cannot go there. That was very difficult for me as well, not just in terms of the research, but also in terms of the judgment. Yeah. Trying to find a position there that fit with liberalism, that was respectful to it, but that disagreed where it thought it was dangerous. I think those are the two hard bits. I got so head up answering that question that I can't even remember what the second one was.
It was, what should liberalism look like in 2030?
I mean, it should be in power.
Good answer. Next question coming in from Damien Miranda, using another L word. What are your thoughts on libertarianism conflating and infecting liberalism?
Libertarianism seems to me a failure of judgment on liberal calculation. I mean, so for instance, you take coronavirus, right? Like, the libertarian position says, just let people do whatever they like. You don't have to wear a mask. You can go out wherever you like, and off we go, and everything's fine. Oh, and a few people will die, but whatever, no one's freedom got taken away.
Yeah.
So my next question is, it seems to me that when someone dies, they lose a lot of freedom. They lose the freedom to make any choice whatsoever. So therefore, your freedom calculus is flawed. Essentially, libertarianism to me is an engagement with the first level of freedom calculus thinking, and a complete failure to recognize that there is a second level. In other words, to recognize that other people exist. And this is not, it seems extraordinary to me that this was what needs saying, right? Like, the very first moment that individual freedom was mentioned, which is essentially Richard Overton in the English Civil War in a jail cell, writing down this idea of each man has freedom. Of course, he says man. No one at that time bothered to think, what about the women? There was simply no one asking that question. The second thing he says is, the limit to this freedom is when it affects another man's freedom. And that just seems unbelievably elementary to me. And yet, most of the time, libertarianism fails on that answer. The majority of the time that I look at it, libertarianism is basically just laissez-faire liberalism. You know, at its most sophisticated. At its least sophisticated, it is just this sort of quite infant. It's like they've understood, you know, pages 1 to 5 of a book on liberalism, but they haven't read, you know, pages 5 to 200 on a book on liberalism. So I wish I could give him more credit than that. And look, they're still fellow travelers. They're still people that you can talk to in the same way. You can bring them on side. Those are important conversations to have. But ultimately, most of the time that I look at libertarianism, I just think you've just made a very rudimentary error of reasoning.
Just often a bit juvenile, I think, would be how I would often find their arguments. There is a question coming in now from somebody who I suspect may have seen our Twitter conversation about eating less meat yesterday. I don't eat meat, and Ian's trying to eat less. And the question is, Ian, would it be totally crazy to consider extending our concept of liberalism, so freedom of the individual, as you put it, to include non-human animals?
Yeah, this is really interesting, by the way. This idea keeps on coming up to me because people ask, you know, is there anything that the freedom principle doesn't apply to, right? Like because to me, the freedom of the individual, you can apply that moral idea to almost any problem in politics, and it will start showing you the way to think about it. It won't tell you the answers. Liberalism never does that, but it will show you the way to think about it. Actually, animal rights is one of those areas where that's not the case. Where actually you're dealing with a different category here. You know, even the environment, you can use the liberal principle on that because you think, you know, how much human freedom is taken away by climate change? What are the effects there? Animal rights are actually a qualitatively different process. And I think legitimately, you could go either way on individual freedom arguments. You can either say, you know, they are there to be used, or you can say these are sentient beings with rights, you know. And I think most people would be much more sympathetic, and by most people I mean most meat eaters, especially in this country, would be much more sympathetic with the second answer than they would be with the first. So the core liberal principle, freedom of the individual, I don't think helps you very much. But some of the accompanying ideas, reason, moderation, those ideas, I think, will inform a sensible discussion about these sorts of issues.
And not least, I suppose, because the consumption of animal products does have an impact environmentally, and of course, you know, in terms of pandemics and the leap, and all of these viruses, whether bird flu, swine flu, MERS, SARS, or COVID, have all made the leap from humans, from animals into humans.
Okay. Like you might have some opinions on this matter, Naomi. I don't know. Yeah.
Questions next time, maybe. John Speller, do you think we should formalise our constitution, i.e. write it all down in one place, to avoid the distortions that have been used by this government? And do you think it will ever happen?
I used to be really complacent about this. I used to basically have this sort of image of like, Britain gets along just fine. We're quite good. It just runs along.
Constitutionalist.
Yeah, well, and yes, but I also had this sort of you know what? It's a dangerous game, writing a constitution, and everyone wants it written when their lot are in charge, and they really, really don't want to. I mean, imagine if they were to do it now, right? So you're still in a dangerous area there. I do accept it can help firm things up, especially in terms of the protection of powers. However, I beg your pardon, the separation of powers. However, look, Orban basically wrote a constitution as soon as he got into power. If you look at the survival and the resilience of the judicial system here, the most obvious cases are the 2 Supreme Court judgments against the government, both under Mayor and under Johnson. You see that kind of almost what matters more than the constitution is the sort of confidence and the longevity and the gravity of the constitutional arrangements underlaying them. So I would be more open to the idea of Britain needing a constitution now. I'd be very wary of when it was done. I don't want to give any ideas to the guys in charge right now. But I will also say that I don't think it's as important as maintaining the sort of the norms around the constitutional arrangement. I think that one of the great protections that Britain has right now is in some of those key areas. Those norms have been more resilient than the actual formal areas of political mechanisms that have been taking place. So, yeah, I mean, I'm more open to it, but still a little bit wary of us becoming overly obsessed with that area of thought. We have got time for just a couple more questions.
We've got one. Oh dear. Here's another one, Ian. We've got Jonathan asking, is monarchy consistent with a liberal democracy? Another one where Ian and I may have a minor disagreement.
No, I wasn't aware that you had any views on this at all. I thought,
off with their heads.
So I think whichever way you go on it, I don't think it's strictly pertinent to the liberal calculation. And I think most of the history of liberalism sort of reflects that. Like you take Benjamin Constant. I mean, one of the things that Benjamin Constant was sort of Napoleonic era, French liberal philosopher. I would argue, it's not a popular argument, but I would argue he's the first guy to put liberalism on a sort of mature modern setting. He was much mocked for the fact that he didn't care who he had alliances with. He didn't really care what system of government he lived under. And admittedly, this is after the French Revolution, right? So it's like, you know, republic, monarchy, and then it's just like Napoleon. And that's the end of that. And he just had the same thing. He was just like, well, ultimately, the principles that we're dealing with here with, you know, freedom of the individual, et cetera, we can make that work under any of these systems. And I think ultimately that judgment holds true. It's actually quite rare that the issue of monarchy comes up in liberalism, which is ironic because, of course, the origin of liberalism is in the fight against the monarchy. So, you know, with the English Civil War and obviously with the French Revolution and with the American Revolution as well. But even there, in the furnace of those revolutions, they didn't really care whether they had a monarchy or not. Most of those guys, you know, the English revolutionaries, the French revolutionaries, not the American revolutionaries, were completely open to just keeping the monarchy and just, well, let's see if we can make this work. In the French case, they're eventually like, no, we can't. We are going to have to kill you. In the English case, they were like, we're going to have to kill you. And then afterwards, we'll try and put you back in. So that ambivalent relationship has always sort of been there. And I would argue, again, Naomi, I know that you don't agree with me on this. But I would argue that really the monarchy issue isn't strictly pertinent to the liberal issue. And you can pretty much go either way on that one.
Well, we're going to have one final question. And I'm going to frame it by saying that, of course, liberals can be found in many parties. They are certainly not concentrated in one. And in fact, you know, some people in the Liberal Democrats probably aren't particularly liberal, but there are liberals in the Conservatives and also in Labour. And so Gabrielle gets the floor for our final question to you this evening, Ian. What do you think Labour should do next?
I want to be more interesting than this, but largely I feel that Labour is doing what it needs to do. And what we all need Labour to do, regardless of whether we're supporters or not, and I'm not a Labour supporter and I frankly don't vote for them that often, I sometimes do, is we need Labour in power. That's the only way that these guys go. We can't be, you know, unrealistic about it. That's the only way to get rid of these guys. What I think our job is to get Keir Starmer on as liberal a footing as possible before that happens. And it's not enough for us to just rely on his better instinct. Well, I think he has good instincts, but we can't rely on that. The pressure has to be coming from a liberal side on issues like the EU, yes, but also on other issues. I mean, his tendency is clearly to just sort of slide with more sort of nationalist agendas. I think we saw it recently on that police spies bill. I think we've been seeing it a bit in the House of Lords today on sort of immigration arrangements for Brits coming back with foreign spouses to the UK. He will want to let that stuff slide, and it's important to try and hold him to those issues, not in a way that damages him with the public, where it's sort of clear issue where they're going to take damage. You have to think we'd rather have these guys in. But we need him on a more liberal footing. I think the same applies to electoral reform, which we urgently need, especially if there's Scottish independence, to make sure that we even have the capacity for a liberal left government in England in the future. So it's up to us to get Keir Starmer into a position where he is afraid of and has to help liberals. Because if we don't, then no matter how many changes take place, it won't get us to the outcome that we're looking for.
Well, that is all that we have time for this evening. If you enjoyed tonight, then please hit the like button, share the video on social media and subscribe to our channels. And of course, do go and buy Ian's book using the discount code displayed under the video. Ian, thank you so much.
No, thanks, mate. It was a pleasure.
You gonna have a bit more of the old Chablis or whatever it was?
I'm gonna smash it. Yeah. Where are you exactly? This is a very blank room that you found.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's one where there's good lighting.
I'm very impressed by your intellectual confidence not to put bookshelves behind you, which is what everyone else does. So.
And to everyone watching, keep up the good fight. Thank you very much for watching, and we will see you again soon. Goodbye.